It's not surprising that cards that are good get remembered in the game's history. If something's good, a lot of people win with it, maybe it wins a YCS or something, and a lot of people lose to it as well, and it doesn't even matter if it makes it to the Forbidden or Limited list, although that definitely does help, because once a card hits that list, it is forever solidified into everyone's memories and the game's history, because if a card is good but doesn't make that list, well, then people do have the chance to forget about it, but we'll never forget about cards that were at one point on the ban list. I think of a card like Tsukiyomi. Everyone knew that card way back in 2005, and obviously when it did get banned, people remembered it. But even now that it's off the ban list, I think if you ask the average player what Tsukiyomi did, they would probably know at least somewhat what that card's effect was and why it was played back in GOAT decks way back in 2005. The other end of the spectrum is cards that are so bad and have silly artwork that they sort of have a cult following. I think of cards like Shape Snatch, I think of cards like Moki Moki, those types of cards that maybe never saw competitive play and probably never will, but they still have sort of a following because they're so terrible that people just find them endearing. And that's kind of the two ends of the spectrum, but there's thousands of cards between those. And I think that's the real shame. I think the real downside of like having so many cards in your card game is that there's all these cards in the middle that are just painfully mediocre. And the Wicked Gods, which is what we're going to be talking about in today's video, fall into this category. They are not as iconic as the Egyptian Gods, which were played in the original series. They're not as powerful as the Sacred Beast, which actually saw some experimentation and also have received some support as the years have gone on. The Wicked Gods are just somewhere in between. They're not very good, and they also aren't very iconic, so a lot of people forget about them. And in today's video we are going to talk about why nobody plays the Wicked Gods. Much like the Sacred Beast, the Wicked Gods are based on the 3 original Egyptian god cards. However, we'll immediately see that their summoning conditions are so awful, so all 3 of them cannot be special summoned in any way. They also can't be normal summoned or set except by attributing 3 monsters. So if we flash back to the Egyptian gods, where they all had that effect, except Slifer and Obelisk, both could technically be special summoned, they just blew up in the end phase. But that's worth noting that these cards can't be special summoned in any means, and also you have to tribute 3 monsters to summon them, so it's not looking so hot. So let's see what their effects are. The Wicked Dreadroot is the Obelisk retrain, and its effect is really straightforward, actually less than 2 lines of text besides the summoning condition. It says have the attack and defense of all monsters on the field except this card, and that is really disappointing. I think that when you're tributing 3 cards for something, or any time in Yu-Gi-Oh, when you're consolidating 3 cards into 1 card, that 1 card has to be pretty darn good. I think back to cards like Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, a card that immediately recuperates your loss because you lose 3 monsters to summon 1 guy, so that's a -2 in card advantage because coming out of the extra deck, you start with 3 cards, you end up with 1 card, so then you're a -2 in card advantage, but when it comes out, you get to banish 3 cards, so you actually end up going even. If you hit a card on their field and a card in your opponent's hand, that's going even in card economy, and then the graveyard card is kind of free, although it doesn't actually play into account of the card economy. But anyway, that card is like a huge payoff for 3 monsters, and so I think that if we compare all of these monsters to sort of that kind of thing, or even to the original Egyptian gods, we'll kind of see why they don't work so well. And the Wicked Dreadroot is just painfully mediocre like the rest of these cards, but I think more so than the other 2, this card is just so boring. I mean, it doesn't really do anything flashy. It looks cool, but it kind of suffers from the same problem that I talk about a lot. I think I talked about this when I talked about Uriah and all those sorts of cards. When a card has more than 3,000 attack, it really can just attack over anything usually, and it doesn't really matter if you increase its attack or if it decreases other cards' attacks or defense, and that's really the case with the Wicked Dreadroot. This thing wouldn't have had any issue running over any card without the attack having effect, and yet that's the only effect it has. So kind of just, I mean, honestly, this card is worse than Obelisk the Tormentor in basically every single way, which is something that I didn't think I would say about any card. But let's move on to the Wicked Eraser. This card did see some experimentation, we'll get to that in a second. So it has the exact same summoning condition, but then also the attack and defense of this card are each equal to the number of cards your opponent controls times 1,000. So if your opponent has 1 card, it has 1,000 attack, 2 cards, 2,000 attack, etc. When this card is destroyed into the graveyard, destroy all cards on the field. during your main phase, you can destroy this card. So a couple things to talk about here. First off, this card can simply be played around by your opponent not activating any cards or placing any cards on the field, and that's kind of rough. A lot of times I like to talk about how when cards require your opponent to do things, that weakens the power level of the cards themselves. Now, there are obviously exceptions to this, because that would mean that basically every trap card isn't good, but cards like Solemn Strike and Solemn Judgment and Solemn Warning are obviously good cards because they interact with the opponent. But many of the best decks in the game, especially when we're looking at monster card effects, they don't interact with the opponent, or they don't have to interact with the opponent. The Wicked Eraser suffers because your opponent can just not set anything or not play anything, and then it has 0 attack points, and you might think that that's worth it. You might think, well, that makes this card good because your opponent can't or won't play anything, and now you just have a big guy. That's not really what happens, though. What happens is your opponent just summons like one guy and attacks over this thing, so only has 1,000 attack. That's pretty disappointing. And yes, so when this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, destroy all cards on the field. This is why this card saw experimentation. So you could pop this card with a card like Fire King Avatar, or is it just Fire King Yaksha? The Yaksha Fire King can pop this card in your hand. That's kind of neat, although Fire Kings already have Garunic, so I'm not sure that's really necessary. This card was briefly played around with True Dracos and True Kings, because they can play Dragonic Diagram to pop this card in the hand and blow up the field. That's kind of neat, but in general, it's not worth it. You might be thinking, well, the cool thing about this card is you summon it, and then during your main phase, you blow it up. Here's the issue. You've just lost 4 cards to blow up the board when you could have easily just activated Dark Hole or activated Regeki. The fact that this card blows up back row doesn't really make it worth the extra 3 tributes compared to the cards that I just mentioned. Even a card that's as bad as Lightning Vortex would probably be better than the Wicked Eraser if you're trying to go for board wipes. This card is just awkwardly positioned. It only really works if your opponent has a lot of cards, but if your opponent has a lot of cards, it's very likely that one of them can actually just deal with this thing, because the amount of cards your opponent has to have that would do nothing would just have to be ridiculous for this card to have a lot of attack points and also stick on the board. But moving on, let's look at the last Wicked God, and this one is the weirdest of the bunch for a lot of reasons. First off, what is this artwork? The Wicked Avatar is literally just a bowling ball. That is so strange for a card that is supposed to be the embodiment of evil, and I do know that because it's the opposite of the original God cards. This is supposed to be the Ring Dragon of Ra retrain. It's supposed to sort of mimic Raw Sphere mode, and boy does it look silly. I mean, it looks like they didn't finish the artwork. What a ridiculous looking card. Anyway though, this card is strange. So your opponent cannot activate spell or trap cards until the end of their second turn. After this card is normal summoned, that's actually really cool, and if the other effect didn't suck so bad, this card might actually be playable. The problem is the attack and defense of this card are each 100 points higher than the highest face-up monster's attack on the field. So the problem here is that even though it has this really cool stun effect, which I think a lot of people forgot about, I forgot about it, I definitely didn't know about that. The problem is that this, while it technically doesn't require your opponent to have anything, because you could have another high attack monster, there's almost no scenario where you will be able to summon 3 monsters, tribute them to normal summon this thing, and then also have a high attack monster on the field so that this thing doesn't just have 0 attack points or like 1500 or something. And if all those pieces align, well, you probably could have just made like a synchro summon or a seed summon or a link summon. Any other type of summon probably would have been better than the Wicked Avatar. And it really does suck, because this card would have been cool if it had just like, honestly, if this card just had 3000 attack, that would have been probably enough for this to see play in some format. The stun effect is really interesting, and if it just was on a bigger body, a bigger consistent body, because I do realize this card technically can have a lot of attack points, but if it was consistently on a monster with 3000 attack, that might have been a neat effect. Now, if we do look at modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, which I don't usually do in these videos, this kind of effect simply doesn't matter and hasn't mattered for a very long time. Cold Wave and cards like it were really good back in the day when effect monsters weren't as powerful as they were. Nowadays, we see decks like Pendulum Editions where they're only playing like 4 4 spells in the entire deck, and the other 36 cards are monsters, and I think that's pretty common. We see that with grass decks. Really the only deck right now in the metagame that doesn't play that many monsters is True Dracos, and even then, they wouldn't really care if they if you summon this against them, because they could still set their spells and traps and tribute them for Masterpiece, so it's not really that big a deal. But Yu-Gi-Oh, for the most part, has moved away from a reliance on spells and traps and their effects, and pretty much is a monster-oriented game with the spells and traps, just more consistent ways to get to your monsters. We see cards like Pot of Desires, Pot of Duality, Card of Demise. Those cards are played specifically to see your monster cards, not so much to see your other spells and traps, which means that this card's stun effect is not as good as when it came out. But even then, when this card came out, and when all these cards came out, none of them really saw any competitive play other than the Wicked Eraser with that really, really small experimentation in both Fire Kings and Dragonic Diagram decks. Outside of that, though, boy, these cards are just underwhelming. I mean, I started off the video talking about how they're so painfully mediocre, but I really feel that that's their card's problem. These cards aren't that interesting. They're not terrible, but they're certainly not good, which puts them in that really awkward middle ground where people just don't remember them. And I think that's kind of like the problem for a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. If they're not iconic, if they're not good, or they're not utterly terrible, people just don't remember them as the year goes on. And I think that most people, if you remember the Egyptian gods and the sacred beasts, you might not remember the wicked gods, which I think is pretty sad, because they're kind of interesting and they all kind of have promise. Well, maybe not so much Dreadroot, that card's pretty terrible, but the other two at least have some promise compared to the sacred beasts and god cards, but they're simply not quite good enough to actually be playable. Anyway, though, that is going to wrap up my discussion on why nobody plays the Wicked Gods. I don't even know if there's any God cards next. I mean, there's like the Earthbound Immortals. Are those God cards? I don't know. Let me know what you would like to see in this series on next time, and yeah, I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.